pleased to have with me this afternoon Nevin Midland, who is a community activist in the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as well as Scott Skrokoff, who I happen to believe is one of the leading thinkers when it comes to live stream videos and social media. Scott's been around since the beginnings of Google Plus Hangouts on Air. He helped roll out Ronnie Benser's Mastery Group, and he is again one of the leading thinkers. And we're grateful that he decided to join us because we want to have a brief conversation about what we're up to here in Harrisburg and how best to roll this out for the community. This is not about a virtual forum that provides a forum for the leaders in this community to talk down to the people in the community. This is about people-to-people communication, ground-up democracy. And Nevin, why don't you take it over, because you have the eloquent articulation of this concept, and I want Scott to hear it.
All right. We have a dysfunctional community. Part of it is because they've been taught not to be citizens, and in order to get them engaged, we need to have a very, what would you call, deliberative dialogue among the people in this community on a whole range of issues that leads to community action. It needs to move in a direction where they begin to find the wherewithal to work with each other and begin to take up the working together in different ways that are mutually supportive of each other. So the question is, I know that you can't get them easily out to a public meeting, and I'm not sure that's an effective, by itself at least, not an effective way of dealing with this. I know that from talking with folks like Mitchell Silver, who was with the City Planners Association, he indicated it really also depends on age groups. Some age groups will show up, other age groups will not show up. They look to social media. So what I'm trying to do is figure out a way in which to make sure that we have the most effective multi-platform structure that will engage people in a conversation among themselves that is positively directed, moving toward action. So we've looked at, Scott and I, that is, we've looked at different platforms, and we're working off of one for the coming program, Blab, but we've looked at Google Hangouts as well, and we've looked at the way of possibility of connecting to internet radio, and we've even considered the ability of setting it up so that you have a town conversation that includes perhaps a space where people can gather and use a microphone there as part of the online conversation, so you have physical space as well as virtual space being merged. So the question is how best to go about it, and are we on the right path, and is there a better way to do it? Is that good enough to start?
That's great. Scott, do you want me to respond, or what's the next step?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Great introduction, Nevin. I think that you're really on a good way forward. And this is kind of a conversation, I hope, that we'll be able to bounce off of each other and maybe come up with some new things. While you were talking, I took a few notes, and at the very top of the list is the concept that even though internet time is super fast and we expect things to occur almost instantaneously, what you're really talking about are relationships, and relationships are built in real time, which means that it will, instead of taking minutes or days or even weeks, sometimes it takes weeks and months in order for people to become aware of the technology, to become aware of who you are and their neighbors, to build up a trust between the two, and then eventually to have that comfort zone so that they can talk as extemporaneously as the three of us are talking right now. So that's one of the big barriers, is that relationships occur and they're built in real time, whereas we're all used to things happening fast in internet time. One of the things that has been a traditional barrier, which has been virtually wiped away entirely, is that at one time the one-to-many or some-to-some communications that you're talking about were reserved for the very few, the very wealthy, the famous, and the powerful. You need to have an FCC license, for example, and then you would have a microphone and maybe a camera, and you could communicate to the community at large. Now, with the internet, everybody has an FCC license, essentially. All you need is a camera, a headset, microphone, computer, and access to the internet, and you can communicate unmediated by anyone else. So that is what is revolutionary about what's going on nowadays. So I think as an early adapter, you're tapping into something that is very interesting and very powerful. And this has been tried, and sometimes with success and sometimes with less success. As an example, I think we've all heard about the Arab Spring, right? And that's an example of regular people marshaling the forces of social media so that they can have a voice of their own and communicate it throughout society. That's the good news. What's the bad news? Two things. One is that throughout many of these countries that had the Arab Spring, had the revolutions, they didn't have the tradition and the backstop and the follow-through, so that once they were able to exert their influence, that they would be able to keep it. So it's been so disappointing, whether it's been in Egypt or the Ukraine or elsewhere, that the social movement didn't follow through to something that was more successful. Well, here in the United States, that's entirely different, because we have a rich and strong tradition for democracy, for individualism. We think of ourselves as innovators. We've got a grasp on technology. We've got strong First Amendment rights. So it's really hard to take the voices of the people, the ground-up voices, in my opinion, and then to be able to smash them down here in the United States. So what's the barrier? It's that people just haven't done it yet. It's that maybe there's a little bit of a hesitancy if you want to have them get on a forum such as this one or a Blab and talk back and forth. But believe me, that camera just disappears very quickly once you start using it. It's just like talking across the table in a coffee shop right now, for those of us who've been on air for just a little bit. So, Nevin, based on kind of what you said, those were some of the thoughts that came to mind immediately.
Well, I think you're right about things, and I understand all that. I think part of the problem actually has been that the public has been taught not to participate. They've been told that someone will solve their problem for them, so that they don't really. I mean, the line I've used is we have socialized personal responsibility, and we need to personalize social responsibility. But we haven't really taught people and engaged people in doing it. Too often when there's a public meeting, you end up with talking heads or people who are given an opportunity to stand at a microphone, not necessarily to talk with each other in a deliberative fashion. And I know that there are people that are out there like NCDD that are trying to encourage that kind of deliberative dialogue, but it's not common, and I don't think people know how to do it. And if they want to become citizens again and they want to change the narrative, to use some of the language of guys like John McKnight and Peter Block, the thing is that you've got to help them to get involved in that kind of a conversation. And and it is seemingly new. I mean, Scott brings stuff to me on technology that I'm not aware of, and even though I've got gray hair, I'm sort of savvy with some of this stuff. But we've got to engage people, and we've got to teach them how to re-engage. And I guess the question is, what technologies work best for that? And then part of it is we're going to have to figure out, I think, the methodologies that facilitate dialogue across many people that offer the opportunity for face-to-face, even if it's only a couple in front of the camera at a time, for them to be able, to carry on that conversation.
Well, what you say is exactly right, and that is, and you're talking now more in the political realm and in the social change realm. I would say that it's very much of a generational issue as well, because those people, kids, teenagers, and those who are in their early 20s, they don't know anything other than the communications through texting and through video and through the internet and those sorts of things. And then there's those who are a little bit older who kind of grew up in one world, the TV world, but have had computers all of their lives, and they're on this platform. And then there are thus, you call us our gray hairs, and I can attest to that as well. My favorite story is that when I was in college, Leonard Nimoy was on the speaking circuit, and he told a story of how and this was when Star Trek was, at its height, right? He was in Boston in his convertible, and a beautiful young lady in her convertible came right up next to him, and she went like this. And he turned to her, and she said, "My dear, it's this." And she said, "Oh, I speak Vulcan with an accent." Well, you and I speak technology with an accent. We might be proficient, we might understand it, but it's a learned behavior. It's something that's kind of new to us. For the kids nowadays, it's second nature. They are proficient in it, and it's a first language for them. So that's a little bit of the hope, that there are already a generation that are very effectively communicating using these technologies. The second component is that you can think about how everybody is sick and tired of commercials, and you will look at whatever commercials there are, and there's a barrier between the two. You just know that you're being marketed to, and it's media literacy on the commercial side. And the revolution that we've seen so far is that now, if we want to buy a product or find out more about a company, we can go to online reviews, we talk to each other on Facebook. There are peer-to-peer communications that we trust more than we do the traditional one-to-many advertising. Not that that's gone away entirely. And marketers and businesses that want to survive in this new world spend a long time engaging. They do that. You might have heard of content marketing. There are all sorts of different strategies for businesses to put themselves out and say, you can get to know us, you can trust us, and then once that connection has been made, then we can have a relationship. And what I will say is that the political dialogue that's so important to you and that is so vital for a healthy community, that political dialogue will follow the lessons learned and the skill sets that are being developed on the commerce or the money side of it. So I'm very... Go ahead.
I was going to say, so if I understand what you're saying, I shouldn't worry too much about the interaction, that if it's a moderated conversation on the margin so that you're not interfering with it, but you're managing a little bit, that the younger generation will intuitively understand how to interact with each other through the medium.
My son is on Reddit, and I kind of know it a little bit, and then we are on Twitter. So there are all sorts of new experiments, and there are all sorts of new institutions that are that are forming right now, and that's why we're in such an exciting time, is that we are upsetting the apple cart and doing things that are brand new. What's needed is leadership, and what, as I understand, you're hoping to do in Harrisburg is to provide the leadership so that people will have a pathway so that they can apply the technology and apply their new gained power in a political discourse that returns what at the end of the day is happening is that it's returning the power into the hands of regular people, and the
Amen.
power structure just doesn't know what to do with it. I mean, had they realized what was going to happen, they would have never made the internet free. That's what net neutrality is all about. They would have never let it be, us communicating unmediated under the umbrella of the First Amendment. And it is just revolutionizing the world around. And we don't know where it's going.
So let me ask you a question, Guy.
If I can, the thing that was fascinating to me as I was growing up through some of this stuff with a fax machine to begin it, in many respects, was the most recent Russian revolution with glasnost. Actually took place because although there was all kinds of censorship, individuals figured out that they could fax documents between each other that were totally unmediated, controlled by the powers that be. Yep. And the whole thing that occurred in Moscow that blew open everything, in many respects, was driven by that very marginal type of technology by today's standards. So I have every hope that this thing will go just fine once we figure out exactly how to make it work.
Yeah, let me ask you a question, Scott and Nevin. With respect to the local Blab that we're going to start, which will launch on April 7th at 7 p.m. What I see that there is a barrier in getting people to use it, to getting people there participating in the Blab live. And I guess you have the choice. Do you use locals and train them to get into it, or do you use folks outside of the area to demonstrate the power of it?
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I mean, early on, one of the things Scott brought up was different platforms. And I think that there's a couple different things going on. One is different parts of the community use different platforms. I know, for example, in this area, the African American community does not use Twitter. They use Facebook. Okay, and I don't know the whole range of what the different platforms are. So one of the issues is how do you merge platforms or link platforms in a way that will draw different parts of the community into the conversation through the platform that they're most comfortable with, at least initially, even if you get them to sort of direct it into something that might work better for them once they figure it out. The other side of that equation, and what we're interested in Scott's comment on this very much, is that I think that some people leaven what's going on, that leaven the conversation is probably a very good thing, but I think that the power of social media is that it is exactly what's happened forever in human interaction. There are social networks. We've amplified the social networks. We have sped them up. But in the end, it's going to be that word of mouth and interaction among people on the street that says, hey, this is worth doing. Did you try that? You ought to get involved in it. And I think that's the relationship thing that Scott brought up early on when he said, what we're looking at is using technology to build relationships across people who have been taught, or for whatever reason, not to have those relationships in the agora, in the public square, and they've got to figure out how to relearn how to do that. But they are still going to rely on those relationships to build whatever conversation is going to take place, and that's the only authentic conversation there will be. Scott?
So when you say Scott, we don't know who you're talking. Yeah, and you can't
that's true.
why don't you call me Scotty?
Okay.
We've had this problem before, right, Scott?
Yes, we have, Scott. Well, I'm just going to jump in. May I, Scott?
Yeah, go ahead. You got the floor.
Well, you asked the question of, you mentioned about Blab, and one of the reasons for utilizing the Blab platform is because it's drop-jaw easy, and it just happens. But you're right, Nevin. At the end of the day, it just kind of takes time. There's a person I follow, David Amerlin, who's come up with a great analogy and insight, and that is that social media has allowed us to reintroduce into society pre-industrial revolution, town square, what's the word I'm looking for, dynamics. It used to be that people would be in a town square and they could communicate with each other, and as a result they'd get to know each other and they'd trust each other, and someone would say, oh, my horse needs shoeing, who's a good blacksmith, and the relationships that they have in the town square are so important to each other that they would never jeopardize it by saying, oh, go to Joe down the street if Joe wouldn't deliver value. It's just not worth ruining that relationship. Now we have not the town square, but we have the global village, and we get to communicate back and forth, and when we talk with each other, the relationships that we build over time are more important than trying to just get a quick sale and then go someplace else. So it's organic in terms of how the word spreads. So Scott, as your original question was, do we start off with locals talking with each other, or do you start off with people maybe from the outside around the country or wherever talking, and then you go from there? And maybe the answer is you start off with value. You start off with something that has actual value for your intended audience, regardless of the source, and then let people through word of mouth organically bring their friends in and say, hey, there is something that I saw the other day that was really interesting, you'd be interested in it. And if it turns out that it's on Facebook that is their platform, then put it out there on Facebook. If it's Twitter, do that. If it's Blab, meet the people where they are. And then I imagine there's even an opportunity to have paid media. So you have earned media and you have paid media and organic media. It's a big deal. And yet those who have that skill set to marshal the brand new rules of social media are able to establish a beachhead. And there is an advantage of being an early adopter. First of all, you're developing the skill set that your quote-unquote competitors don't have. Secondly, there is a tendency for a winner-take-all on the internet because people like to be where people are. And the example I like to use is Amazon, obviously, because people originally were very scared to put their credit card number onto the internet, so they just didn't want to have a stranger company do it. They wanted to go to some place that they felt that they could trust. And when Amazon got to a certain critical point, they said, well, everyone else is entrusting their credit card to Amazon. I guess I can do that too. And then there's another level, and that is, why should I go off to this other place that may or may not have what I want? I can go to this one place where I can have everything that I want. And it's just it's just a phenomena that early adopters and that those who are proficient and gain the trust are the king of the mountain, and it's hard to knock off the king of the mountain. Of course, the corollary to that is, or the opposite of that, is that you know who the pioneers are because they're the ones who have arrows in their back. The very first people are shot down oftentimes, and then you have others come by and take up the space.
That sort of reminds me of the line, "It doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger."
You'll have to repeat that. You broke up a little bit.
Oh, I said it reminds me of the line, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So,
notice, Nevin, we're in such leading edge around here. Nobody's doing this in the Harrisburg area. Penn Live, Tara Ockley, none of these digital publishers have even considered doing this. The Berg magazine, Harrisburg magazine, none of this is being done.
No, they're doing podcasts, which means they have this person. That's what I said the other day. They're at the point where they will sit down and do an interview with somebody and then push it out there for people to look at, as opposed to engaging the broader view and engaging the public and trusting the public to have a worthwhile conversation. People do have worthwhile conversations. They work things out. We're social animals, and I always the corporate body, so to speak, is a body politic. I mean, in many respects, it's just like the human body. It's an integrated whole, and each of us plays a different role and part. You've got to have this ubiquitous conversation. The mind is not the arbiter of the conversation. The mind is the enabler of real-time, ubiquitous conversation of all parts of your being with all parts of your being. And there are even people who consider the idea that thought is actually time binding. It's when all parts of your being focus on one thing at the same time, which in many respects is the kind of thing that religion used to do when people were brought together at a certain point. If you can get people to agree on certain standards as they work them through together, and if you get them to agree to certain goals, you don't need someone to enforce it. You don't need somebody to impose it, because they willingly take it on themselves, because it's not forced on them. It's something they've come to the conclusion makes sense, and then they all go about doing the work they think needs to be done with it. So by facilitating that common consciousness, which is exactly what social media has been able to do, that's what makes this so incredibly powerful. And before we break up today, I want to make sure that we have the right platforms, and if Scotty has any thoughts on that, I'd like to hear that as well. But I don't want to break this, I just don't want to lose that thought.
Sure. Well, you talked about podcasts, and you talked about video, and you talked about the interaction of live interaction between people. I think podcasts are very powerful nowadays because people can multitask, or they can do two things at one time. They can be running or exercising or doing the dishes or something like that, and they like the idea of being able to listen to something on long form for 15 or 20 minutes or however long that is. And that's one of the powers of podcast, of when I have control over when I can start listening to it, and I can listen to something over a long period of time. Video has a tendency to be, you have to have my full attention. I have to sit here, stop everything I'm doing, and take a look at the video, both visually and auditorially. And what that lends itself in isolation is more short form. In other words, video snippets. People will be more likely to watch something that's between a minute and 3.5 or 4 minutes. The barrier to doing that is much less than if you have to invest a whole half an hour in a long program. And the funny thing is that if you have a series of very short videos and they're of interest to me, Okay, I might look at the first one and be motivated to look at the second, third, and the fourth. Studies have shown that people will string short videos together. But if you gave me a 23-minute video that was straight through, I'd think, oh my gosh, well, I'm going to put that on my to-do list because I don't have 23 minutes to watch right now, even though I've got 23 minutes to watch short video snippets. And then I guess then the third component is that there is three or four. The third component is asynchronous communications, and that's one of the powers of the internet. In other words, I can get something out to you in text, and I can do it at my convenience. So I type a comment. You log on at your convenience. You might be a half a world away, different time zones, but you'll see what I've written, and then you'll reply to it, and we can have a dialogue back and forth. That's a little bit of what maybe email is, or they talk about having a post and having threads. So these are new ways of communicating back and forth. And then the fourth is the live exchange like we're having right now. And this is the interpersonal relationships that we have, and what makes this so powerful is that we get to read the body language of the other person.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, early on I had a I was at Carlisle Army War College, and right after they began to do video conferencing. And one of the things that came out was that it was very important, even though you could move a project around the world by moving it electronically to whoever was up for a work day at the right time, and you could bring people together at certain times, scheduled well, so they could interact. At some point, first of all, you needed the video so they could visualize the body language. Understand it, and oftentimes there was a need they found to have in-person interaction among these people, that bring them together at some point, because there was a need for them to have that personal touch element of it, so that when they interacted with somebody at a long distance, even watching them, they had a personal relationship that was more than flat screen, so to speak.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm not entirely certain how important in-person interactions are. It probably is, but my experience is, and Scott can attest to this, and that is having the ability to get to know people just like you and I have now been introduced, Nevin. I feel very close to and attached to more people probably online in the last 3 or 4 years that I've been doing this than I have in real life. And this is amazing to people who don't experience it, and it is just common knowledge amongst those of us who have this experience of getting to know each other through this live interaction. It is, and people will say, I feel that I know so-and-so, so that when, well, and I've got a story about it, if you've got the time. When you actually do meet IRL in real life, it's like picking up as if you've just known the person in person forever. And the example I have for that is that I had a weekly program with a co-host, and we drove down from Seattle to Portland to meet some of our internet friends, some of our hangout friends, people we knew in terms of hangouts but had never met in person. And we all met in a restaurant, and there was one person who was unknown to Jess and me, and so when we went in, I'd never seen Susan and the other 3 people who were there, but we hugged and we giggled and whatnot, and then there was her friend, and it was shaking her hand and glad to meet you. And that was the difference. The other person was a stranger, and then everyone else, all of us, were bosom buddies, as it were. And that is the power of this live interaction that you and I are experiencing right now, and that other people can as well. And then our audience feels like they know us as well, even though the audience only participates maybe through chat, if at all.
Yeah, this brings me into probably the reason that I like Blab, because Blab, the bringing in the audience and allowing them to interact with the conversationals in the room works better than the Google Hangout platform. I have never been able to get that message application to work. It's finicky, it's flaky, and you don't know whether it's going to work or not. You can even ask BL Achman.
Yeah.
So one of the nice things about Blab, Nevin, that with our show on Thursday and going forward, we'll be able to bring in the audience. They can come in, they can text, they can ask questions, they can even request to change the topic that we're talking about.
Yeah, but I'm going to have to trust you. I'm sorry, if I may. I'm going to have to trust you to watch what's going on there, because we have to make sure that, and I don't know how to do that, but you do. And as long as you're watching what's happening on the screen and can bring in folks and change who's sitting at the table, so to speak, as it moves along based on what's happening, someone has to watch that to manage that conversation.
Yeah, there needs to be a host and in some instances, a co-host to manage a Blab or even a Hangout that has a lot of participation going on.
Yeah, and I think that's why I suggested we're in the same place.
Let's time out now, and because this conversation does not end with this.
Yeah, I have one question, if I may, before we break up. I want to get to Scotty. As I understand it, and Scott's talked about it, we can take, maybe what we need to do when we're done with this is take certain elements of the conversation and do short YouTube videos in segments of certain things, getting rid of some of the stuff in between, and use that as one format of putting out content in between active sessions. And the other is that the podcast, we could allow for a stream of audio to be put out there that people could listen to in the interim when they weren't watching the thing. So we could take what was a real-time conversation and allow individuals who couldn't be there to participate to catch those conversations in formats that make sense to them.
You know, Nevin, what you're saying is making Scott smile, because what he does, and he's real good at it, he actually works with producers of these Hangouts and Blabs, where he takes the video content, let's say it could be an hour, a good hour, and he chunks it down into manageable size so people won't be resistant to watch it. Like the 15-second ad spot is a lot more powerful than the minute ad today.
So
is that right?
What Scott you're describing and what you're contemplating, Nevin, is what I do professionally, and that is someone. The thing about Hangouts on Air and now Blabs is that you have lay people who are producing video productions, and even though the production values are rising all the time and they're becoming more proficient at it, it still is somewhat of an amateurish enterprise. So for the last several years, for those who have important messages that have to compete on the professional level, I will put those shows into a video editor, and I'll do two things. I'll snip them up so that they're in usually single topic segments, golden nuggets of between 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, something that people want to hear. And then the other thing I do is that I remove all of the flaws. So if people have uhs or ahs, someone is answering a question, oftentimes they'll have an introductory phrase, so they will have filler material, and they'll think, that's a very good question, and the answer to your question is, and then they'll look in the camera and give their script. Well, I take out all of the fluff so that the people at home will have a concise answer to the question that they are asking when they type in whatever it is. Also, you talked about repackaging some of the videos that you produce into different formats, and that is exactly the right way to go, because you repackage it in ways you go to where your audience is and give them the information in the way that they like to consume it.
Very good.
So let's time out. I'm going to end the broadcast. But keep in the room, guys, and then we can end the discussion. So thank you for helping us out here, Scott, to clarify what we're about to launch next Thursday here in Harrisburg, the Street Forum. The first show, we're going to be dealing with the big cleanup that's going on in the city. And I think the next show, we're going to segue it into violence in the city of Harrisburg. And like many cities, I don't think it's as serious here as it is out in Chicago, but Harrisburg has a major crime problem. And as Nevin, you've said it, you need to talk to one another in the neighborhoods to solve this. You can't rely on your police to show up on time. So again, thank you, Scott and Nevin. This conversation doesn't end, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday on Blab.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.